case study. We called it All Eggs in One Basket, and we attempt a critical reflection of Malawi's dependence on an agricultural growth strategy. However, following Paul, we might have chosen a different title and called it an incipient reliance on a non-agricultural growth strategy. The team represented and the key authors are Jonathan Makovira, Ian Kumwenda, and myself. We also worked with a large team of collaborators. Emily's us. Thank you very much for your input. I would like to start by giving you a quick background on Malawi. Malawi is a very small country, but it has good agricultural potential, which supports a very high population density. On average, it's about 138 people per square kilometer in Malawi. The country is landlocked, but it has a large lake with potential for fisheries, tourism, and irrigation. The economy is based on agriculture. Despite that, Malawi has a history of food insecurity. To generate foreign exchange, Malawi relies heavily on tobacco and is one of the biggest exporters of burley tobacco in the world. If we look at the structure of Malawi's economy, here represented GDP in billion Malawi kwacha, we see that agriculture is dominating. From 2002 to 2010, the output increased from around 100 billion to 170 billion. The next important sectors are trade and manufacturing, with transport, tourism, mining, and utilities taking a minor role. If we look at the average share of GDP, over the past agriculture contributed 30% plus minus 2%, so very little variation to GDP. For trade, it's 16% plus minus 4. We have a jump in the data from 2003 to 2004, which we cannot explain very well. It might be a change in calculation of the data. Then manufacturing, around 11%, and the other smaller ones range from 4 to 1% with very little variation. What does that mean for the labor force across sectors? Malawi being agriculturally dominated, it's not surprising that we find the most people being in the agricultural sector as farmers or self-employed, about 80%. If we look at the rural area, it's going up to 90%. Then manufacturing plays a big role in the urban areas. For the national figure, it's less than 5%. Similarly, wholesale and retail sectors. What is very important in the urban area is the social and community services, which is mostly government employment. 42% of all employees or in the workforce are occupied there. Nationally, that's only 9%. Despite that, the purchasing power of that segment is very important for the or domestic market development. When we look at poverty trends, we have here data from 1997 and a time series from 2005 to 2009, disaggregated by rural and urban. We see that we do see a decline in the data from about 67% to 43% for the rural areas, and in urban areas from 55 to 14%. That's still a difference of 17 percentage points. So the divide between rural and urban areas is increasing, despite the overall reduction in poverty levels. We also looked at non-income measures of well-being, and there we see the disparities between rural and urban areas. In rural areas, we find only 5% of all household heads having a school education, secondary school education or higher, compared to 25% in the urban areas. School attendance for children is lower in the rural area compared to urban, and also the access to utilities is much worse in in rural areas. A very sad fact is that out of 1,000 children that are being born, 47 more die before they reach the age of 5 in rural areas compared to urban. There were alarming reports in the past of urbanization rates in Malawi, predicting that by 2015, about 44% of all Malawians would live in urban areas. When we looked at the population census data from National Statistical Office, we found different figures. We have here the 4 big cities in Malawi: Blantyre, Lilongwe, Muzuzu, and Zomba. And we see that Blantyre starts out at about 6% growth rate in the 70s. At that time, it was the biggest city in Malawi with around 109,000 people. And the top grower was Lilongwe at the time, with around 16%. And that is because the government, the capital, was moved from Zomba to Blantyre in the mid-70s, and the city grew in that decade from less than 20,000 to almost 100,000 people. The smaller cities, Muzuzu and Zomba, peaked in the decade later in the 80s, and then all of them kind of reduced the growth rates and now hover around 3.5% to 4%. The top line here is the average of the 4 big cities that we've seen earlier. The solid line is the urban population that doesn't live in the big cities. Those are the people that live in smaller towns or secondary growth centers. And the double line at the bottom is the rural population. What is interesting is that the smaller towns, the share of people living in smaller towns has reduced from 40% in 1966 to 23% in 2008. Still, only 15.3% of the 13 million Malawians live in urban areas, according to the definition of the National Statistical Office. If we look at different measures of urbanization, the agglomeration indices, we calculated 22.7% of Malawians living in an area with a population density higher than 150 people that can reach a town of larger than 50,000 people in less than 1 hour. We have here on the left side the region in the south, Blantyre and Zomba, and you can see that those 2 cities almost grow together. Then in the middle you see Lilongwe, which has an almost star-shaped growth pattern. In the east of the town you have a range of hills which block the spread there. And then on the right side, Muzuzu, the hub in the north linking the country to Tanzania, and there the agglomeration. Migration is dominated by rural to rural migration, mostly in search of agricultural land. We also have rural-urban migration, which probably is in search of a better life, which is very often disappointed, since we find 20% of people in 1997 moving from urban to rural areas. And we think that that is a kind of circular movement. People are attracted to the big city lights, get disappointed, and after a few years move back to rural areas where they have come from. We do find some urban to urban migration, and that is probably civil servants being transferred from one town to another. Historically, international migration was very important. In the 50s and 60s, a large part of the male population from Malawi has worked in the mining sector in South Africa, northern and southern Rhodesia at the time, but at the moment that is, plays a minor role. Then we looked at net migration patterns. On the left side you find the population densities in 1987 with two centers of high population in the south around the Mount Mulanje, and then Blantyre and Zomba, the two cities in the south, and one center is around Lilongwe. Then in the middle we see the changes from 1987 to 1998. The green shades indicate in-migration and the red shades indicate out-migration. Yellow means there's no significant change. And you can see that people move from the southeast and southern region into towns, especially Lilongwe and Muzuzu, and also into rural districts in the center and the north of the country. Then in the next decade, that trend continues, but to a much lower extent. Then we looked at travel times and costs. Here you can see the connectivity. And surprisingly, Malawians are very well connected. 82% of the population can reach a city with 50,000 or plus people in less than 3 hours. This is probably related to the road network over the past decade. A lot of roads have been upgraded. The percentage of tarred roads has increased by 50%, and the total road network has only increased by 5%. So it has more to do with the quality than the quantity of the roads. When we look at transport costs, that is the major burden for transport within Malawi. It's very expensive to ship goods from the rural area to major towns. It costs about 228 Malawi kwacha per ton per kilometer, which is $1.50 to get goods from the rural areas to major towns. And on the international routes from major towns to ports, the costs are a lot lower. The low volume and the poor conditions of the feeder roads in the rural areas are probably the main reason for the high transport costs, and there's very limited competition on these internal routes because of the low volumes that need to be transported. Transporters complain that there's virtually no backload. So when you pick up something, you have one empty trip already. This is information that comes from the World Bank. The travel time was calculated by Emily. When we look at the region, we see that Malawi is challenged with high transport or travel times from the country to the port. Despite reductions from 1997 to 2007, it still takes about 15 hours from Blantyre to reach Beira. For Muzuzu, that is almost 24 hours, and to Nakala, the times are even more. So that is clearly burdening the competitiveness of the Malawian export sector. Then I would like to come to the policy environment and have a look at the history. All successive governments in Malawi have relied on an agricultural-led and export-oriented development strategy. The first were the British colonial administration, who purely came to Malawi because of geopolitical objectives, but they realized there's agricultural potential in the country for tea and sugar production. They established an estate sector which was expat-run, and after World War II, triggered by a devastating drought and food crisis in 1948, they shifted their focus towards the smallholder sector and to food security issues. In 1964, when Kamuzu Banda led the country into independence, he saw the need to generate resources to implement his development agenda, and he felt that that is only possible through an agricultural estate sector, which relies heavily on tobacco. That strategy worked pretty well in the 60s and 70s. It had a strong growth, but due to managerial inefficiencies and inadequacies, the sector declined in the 80s and 90s. During this period, the smallholder sector was suppressed by a range of policy instruments, which we discuss shortly. Then in the mid-90s, Malawi changed the political system, held a referendum, voted Kamuzu Banda out of power, and the focus shifted to a poverty reduction and food security agenda, because poverty levels were just rife. The first president, Bakili Muluzi, wholeheartedly embraced liberalization policies and relied on the private sector. The liberalization of the tobacco sector was driven forward very much during this period, and because of recurrent droughts and food crises in the mid-2000s, the focus shifted towards food security issues again. During the colonial and Banda regime, the policy instruments that were mostly used were land, labor, wage, and commodity price policies. Land was transferred from smallholders to estates. The labor wage was restrained to curb rural-urban migration and maintain a cheap pool of labor for the estates, and commodity prices were suppressed to supply cheap foods, staple foods for urban population and estates. Kamuzu Banda achieved that by the implementation of the National Rural Development Program, which targeted only a small part of the smallholders, the so-called Achikumba, the elite farmers, and they produced surplus to feed the population. Then in the more recent period, we had the agricultural livestock development and strategy and action plan, and the poverty reduction plans, which had a strong focus on poverty alleviation through the starter pack, food security, and small and medium enterprise development. And then under the current president, Bingu wa Mutharika, he introduced a large subsidy program in the mid-2000s and tied his legacy, his political legacy, to achieving food security for Malawi. That has obviously worked, but it also ingrained maize as the dominant crop in Malawi, and at the moment about 70% of all land is planted to maize in the country. Coming to the conclusions, there have been attempts to diversify the economy and the agricultural sector in Malawi through various policies and strategies, starting from the National Physical Development Plan of 1987 to the more recent Malawi Development and Growth Strategy, and for the agricultural sector, the Agricultural Sector-wide Support Approach Program. But they have, as I said, limited very little results, and they're challenged by low purchasing power in the domestic market, the high transport costs and the high travel time, and these recurrent external shocks that push the country constantly back into management crisis mode, I would call it. We could extend the list for with quite a few other issues. So the level of urbanization remains low, despite the slightly higher population growth in urban areas compared to rural areas. And the bottom line is that agricultural development remains the most promising strategy for growth and poverty reduction in Malawi. So we would suggest to change, ask the question, how do we put more eggs in our basket to the maize and tobacco egg that we have there? And then, how do we spread those amongst other baskets in the sector? Thank you very much. Zikuma.